Race Equality Code 2020. Let's talk about race. If not now, then when? My name's Carl George, and I'm going to do a bit of a double act with Anna O'Keefe, RSM Senior Manager, where I'm going to talk about equality, diversity, and inclusion, and what you need to do as a professional, as a supporter for your clients, and also I think we'll pick up afterwards with a little bit of talk about risk and COVID and where we go with that with Anna. Anyway, I talk about race because in the summer, racial tensions played out across the world, brought a new focus to racial diversity in the leadership of many organizations. And what we recognize that the lack of representation of Black and minority ethnic people across the sector has meant that there's been a real lack in what we can see as efficiency, effectiveness across the private, public and voluntary sector. And to aid boards and promote race equality in their organizations, we at the Governance Forum, together with leading governance experts and proponents around race equality, have come up with this Race Equality Code 2020. So I want to talk to you today then about what I think is a governance solution. You see, Bob Garrett in his book, The Fish Rots from the Head, the title itself talks about leadership and what leadership should do, but the book itself talks about governance. And I start with that to say that if we're going to talk about inequality, we've got to talk about systems, processes and procedures. As Sir Adrian Cadbury said in 1992, corporate governance is the system by which companies are directed and controlled. So if we want to tackle some of this inequality, we've got to tackle the systems, is where we're going to talk. So in terms of introduction, I wanted to just say, as I've been reviewing over the last few years, the updates of governance codes, I'm familiar with the 2018 code for the private sector, and that had a keen emphasis on diversity for the first time. But as we look, and as a result of what we saw over the summer and the Black Lives Matters movement, not the organization so much, but the movement, we've seen that the National Housing Federation in the housing sector have looked at equality, diversity, inclusion as a key component of their work, and diversity in the boardroom and across stakeholders. We look at the voluntary sector and we recognize that when they've updated their code, again, the diversity section now has been expanded to include equality and inclusion. And the sports code is currently being updated. And I know from steering groups that I've been on, that's been a key focus point for people to consider. And if we look at the current government, and we've seen gender pay reporting, and we're now looking at, although it's been on the statute books with nothing happened yet, but ethnicity pay reporting. So that's the context. But in terms of my background, my lived experience collided with my professional experience. And I'll share this picture with you of Handsworth Park back in the 80s when I was a teenager. I know people in the picture actually, but I'm not in there. And I would have been very young at the time when that picture was taken. However, in the 80s, I found myself being stopped by the police in my car regularly because I was relatively successful, drove a nice car at a young age and living in the inner city. And what I found was my relationship with the police wasn't that good. In 2005, as I've started to grow up, relationship a little bit better, but I've been asked now to, on behalf of my community and the local business community, to pull together a peace march between the African, Caribbean and Asian community, because 2 Asian people were killed. And we didn't want it to turn into a bloodbath in our communities. So 2011, I'm having a conversation as a result of the riots that came out of Mark Duggan's killing with my son, who's a teenager. and having the same conversations that I'd had literally 30 years before. The landscape hadn't changed much. In fact, getting stopped, I got stopped with my youngest son taking him to football in the same way and in the same kind of manner when I was a teenager, and I had to demonstrate just to show my son, this is how you deal with the police, respectful and so on, although I wasn't being dealt with. And then stopped with my other son with armed police, would you believe it, outside my house. Things haven't changed that much. But what's hit home for me and what's made it personal, and Black people, Black British, African Caribbean, I don't know if you're aware, but every one of these statistics that we can find, we find that they are at the bottom or second to bottom. And we can analyze that in many different formats. But if you get the theme, you'll understand what I'm talking about, because although we may be breaking through in some areas, it's not reasonable to say that Black workers with degrees earn 23.1% less on average than white workers. This is Race Report Statistics, Healing a Divided Britain. 6% of Black school leavers attended a Russell Group University, compared with 12% of mixed and Asian school leavers and 11% of white school leavers. Rates of prosecution, you might know, and sentencing for Black people were 3 times higher than for white people. Looking at living standards, and let's talk about Pakistani and Bangladeshi as well as Black people, but they're more likely to live in substandard accommodation than white people. And dare I mention COVID-19 and the impact that it's had on BME communities, or the fact that Black African women have a mortality rate that's 4 times higher than white women in the UK. So when I look at all of these statistics, it says to me, Carl, is there something you can do? And actually, although in the past I've worked a lot in the business community, setting up a Black Business Association and a forum to work with the Chambers of Commerce, I decided this time I would look at the things that I'm experienced in. I'm experienced in boards, senior leadership teams, and governance. So decided to review a number of reports in this area, some of them listed here. And these reports, these pledges, these promises, these kite marks have a number of recommendations, something like 200 I counted at my last count, with over 20 reports. And there are quite good solutions to the challenges. If we look at Baroness Rumi McGregor-Smith's report, government sponsored, it has about 26 recommendations about the workforce and workplace and what we need to do to release the 24 billion pounds, yes, I did say that right, 24 billion pounds that we could see if we got equality and diversity of employment on an equal footing. Well, the Parker Review for the private sector, which is trying to get at least 1 Black person on every board by 2021. Yes, we are here now, 2021. Or again, business in the communities that has used the work of McGregor-Smith to create 2 reports, the most recent one, Black Voices, and about another 12 recommendations. Or the NHS Workforce Race Equality Standard, a standard that we can see demonstrating how we look at data, 9 key assessment areas that organizations can use. Or I created about 7 years ago, Diversity in the Boardroom, a pledge to diversity in the boardroom outside of the private sector. Because at the time I was thinking, we've got Parker, we've got these other, we've got Davis in 2011 that talked about gender diversity in the private sector, but what about the public and what about the voluntary sector? Launched with Trevor Phillips, Raj Tulsiani, KPMG those years ago. And I'm not going to go through all of those recommendations to say that we've already got the solution. We know what we need to do, but unfortunately, in terms of representation, Birmingham's 2022 Commonwealth Games boardroom looks like that. Yes, although we're at least 40% be non-white in the Birmingham area, this £800 million or thereabouts coming into the region for us to organise it has one black man on the board and none in the senior leadership team, no ethnic diversity in the senior leadership team. But this just isn't the Birmingham 2022 Commonwealth Games. This is the same across many sectors. There's the private sector, FTSE 100, FTSE 250, not much different. Cabinet members. And NHS Trust, one of the biggest employers in the country, particularly of BME staff, CEOs of top accounting companies, you can see there, and law firms, mayors. So why is this different? Why is the Race Equality Code different? You see, what I wanted to do is pull together a framework, one accountability framework that demonstrates that we can have these pledges, we can have these guidelines, we can have these recommendations, but let's have a governance code so that we comply. So taking you right back to where I started, I think the difference this time in this tipping point that we're in history is to make a difference by using a governance code. And I'm the guy who gets tingly about corporate governance. And there'll be people out there saying, not another cold call. But if we can apply, as King 4 has done, and explain, as opposed to a tick box approach to 4 key principles, perhaps we can make a change. So there's 4 key principles, which I'll share with you, that we apply and explain against. And then this is quite unique. There are things that you must do as an organization. We found 10. Things you should do and things you could do. We found another 41. So about 51 provisions, which is in line with number of codes that are out there. As I mentioned before, the UK Corporate Governance Code, the NHF Code, the Voluntary Sector Code, all have a number of provisions that you need to follow. So just to emphasize that we're not reinventing the wheel. We're not starting from scratch. We're using the existing knowledge and reports and recommendations that are out there, pulling them together in one single accountability framework. And then we're creating musts, shoulds, and coulds for organizations who don't know how to tackle this and make sure that we've got an opportunity to work together. So as I said before, 10 musts, 27 shoulds, 14 coulds. And mathematicians amongst you, if you try and add up the fact that we've got the McGregor Smith reviews 26 and 11 business and community, 13 park reviews, it won't add up. It won't add up because some of them have been combined. There's been a few new ones put in and some, but all of them have been used, including the ones on the right-hand side at the bottom. So in terms of methodology, very quickly, the Governance Institute, Chartered Governance Institute now, some of you remember them as ICSA or ICSA, have worked, well, the West Midlands branch actually, just a number of people there and a technical committee to look at the workings of how we pull the code together. We also have early adopters of the code, organisations in the private sector, some NHS trusts, housing associations, law firms, and also a charity, and then the combined authority in Birmingham and some local authorities, all coming together to adopt the code and then give us some feedback after the consultation period as to how this can be applicable across the private, public and voluntary sector. And with some race code consultants, people who've been in this sector for at least 30 years, some of them 35, we have a number of advisors to the code and strategic support that complements this steering group that we've pulled together. The steering group are people that have got an expertise in governance codes or in race or in equality and diversity. For example, Professor Alexander Vanderput and Simon Osborne, bringing that academic input into the structuring of the code, or from business, Charlotte Villeneuve at the time was chair of the IOD, or from government, Caroline Waters, deputy chair at the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Or practitioners like Yvonne Colgill at the time was head of the Workforce Race Equality Standard, the RACE that I mentioned, or Yvonne Thompson, who sat on the Parker Review. Derek Webley, who co-chairs with Priti Patel the Windrush Inquiry. And Gary Eldon, someone who has run a FTSE 250 company, £1 billion business. I think for at least 10 years he's been there and never been asked after his retirement to sit on a FTSE board. So principles then, principles. There are 7 areas in the philosophy behind the development of the code that I just want to share with you, and then we will work our way through what the 4 key principles are. You see, I've spoken a lot about race and I've spoken about Black, but targeted universalism says if I focus on one particular area, I will make sure that all other areas get the benefit by that particular focus of activity. So what I'm saying is, by focusing on race, it doesn't mean it's to the detriment of LGBT or against gender or any other protected characteristic, to be fair. And it doesn't mean also that we're trying to separate. We're actually looking at inclusion strategies. It's unapologetic that we're talking about Black because of those statistics I shared with you earlier. And we recognize that the responsibility to make change is at the top. At the core of any leadership, we need to make sure that that EDI strategy has got the leaders involved. And the statements that I saw over the summer, around what organizations are going to do, haven't been backed up when you look at what they're doing as practical actions, or even looking at their senior leadership teams and boardrooms. So we say that there should be a zero tolerance to racism. And recruiting Black or young or gender doesn't mean tokenism. It does mean that we're trying to ensure to get that cognitive diversity, and we sometimes talk now about neurodiversity as well, but just to get that real change and efficiency, we want to make sure that we are bringing everybody in. And that means giving opportunity for all, breaking down the barriers to ensure that it's equitable. The reality is, if we don't do it now, when are we going to do it? This has been going on too long. I said in my lived experience, I don't want to speak into my grandchildren about the same things that I've been speaking to my son about in the next generation. In society, we want to make sure there's psychologically safe places for everybody to thrive, for us to have conversations about race, and for us to be comfortable to try and make a change. Every business has got a social contract with society, and it's not just about profits, as Elkington says, John Elkington, but about people and planet also. Triple context, as King Four says. So to finish off then, we have 4 key principles. The first one is reporting. We're suggesting that we report on race specifically within any robust EDI strategy. It can't be standalone. And if we don't measure it, how are we going to make the changes? And there are a couple of examples of what I've pulled out of the McGregor-Smith review, saying that listed companies should publish their targets. It's about publishing, and also talking about ethnicity pay band. Action, it's time to have actions. It's time to make sure we're accountable. So therefore, as I pulled out from the McGregor-Smith review and Parker review, Parker says by 2021, let's have one director of colour at least. Or McGregor-Smith speaks about having a board level sponsor for diversity issues, including race. And a composition of and you probably recognize the acronym now, R for reporting, A for action, C for composition. And this is where we want to make sure that the data stacks up. We need to understand the difference between Black and even within Asian, different challenges for the Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Indian community. Let's not lump them all into one figure. And the Black Voices report from BITC, Business in the Community, says we should set targets of representation. And the RES strategy, the National Health Service, says that there should be a board representation indicator. We've got to get to the data, in other words. And then education. I think this is really important for us to pull the framework together. We've got to create those safe places, as I said before. We've got to understand what the terminology is saying and make sure we're not defensive when we hear terms that are now being bandied around in this area. And does unconscious bias training work? And is it just part of the solution rather than the solution? So the Business in the Community Race at Work Charter suggests that we should consider improving reporting rates by educating the workforce, for example. So there we have it. The vision is a transformational, sustainable, lasting change by having a governance code around race. And once you've done that, as I said before, you are able to use the best practice here to help with other ED&I initiatives. So those 7 parts of the philosophy that are in the drivers, we examine them, we apply and explain against the reporting, action, composition, and execution. And then finally, we comply or explain to our musts, shoulds, and coulds. So if you're not part of the solution, you can't stand on the sidelines anymore because you're probably part of the problem. There's a difference between non-racist and anti-racist because we've got to break down systems, we've got to break down barriers. I conclude with what good looks like. You see, this is part of a systematic business-led approach to EDI. This is what organizations need. This is a framework that they can adopt, and this is something that can make them accountable. So the first thing I say is adopt the code. The second thing I say is tell someone else about the code. And the third thing to finish off is now I'm handing over to Anna O'Keefe, Senior Manager, to talk to you about risk.
Thanks, Carl. So moving on to the second part of this webinar, my name's Anna O'Keefe and I'm a Senior Manager working within Internal Audit at RSM, and I work with a number of registered providers across the south and east of England. I'm going to be talking about the key themes that we identified in the audits we carried out in 2019-20, which resulted in high or medium priority management actions being agreed. And also I'll consider the impact of the pandemic on internal controls. A significant proportion of our 2019-20 work was undertaken pre-COVID, so it's also important to consider what other areas might have been affected by the pandemic. As we do every year, we undertook an analysis of the high and medium priority actions that were agreed in our 2019-20 programme of audits. Across 47 internal audit clients, we agreed 59 high and 510 medium priority actions. To give some context, a high priority action is agreed where there's a serious internal control or risk which needs immediate management attention. A medium priority action is agreed when there is an important control or issue that needs to be addressed, but where a slightly longer timescale for implementation is considered appropriate. For example, 3 months. There were 3 key areas that emerged this year from our analysis, which covered the most actions. These were property and programme management, safety standards and legislation, and IT. And you can see in this graphic there the percentage of the total actions which each of those areas accounted for, and also the split between high and medium priority actions within those areas. There was a decline in actions relating to organisational factors and information management this year, both of which were overtaken by IT-related issues. And we expect to see IT-related issues as a continuing theme when we do the analysis of 2020-21 issues, given the big changes in working practices which most organisations have brought in during the year. So the first area of those three that I'm going to focus on is programme and property management. The latest sector risk profile emphasises that the sector must have an approach to ensuring that the quality of its housing stock is maintained at a decent standard. So boards need to ensure that they continue to invest sufficiently to provide stock that's safe and of appropriate quality. The majority of agreed actions regarding property and programme management related to asset management and maintenance and procurement and contracts, but other areas also included responsive maintenance, lettings processes and inspections. We agreed 5 high priority actions in this area, but this was the largest area for medium priority actions, with 92 actions agreed. Some of the high priority management actions are listed on the slide, and they relate to, firstly, ensuring that the asset and liability register is an accurate and complete representation of the data or information held across the business, and that it easily links back to the data source. So this action would have arisen where we've done an audit in this area and found that that wasn't the case. So perhaps the hyperlinks included within the register don't link back to where they're meant to link, or that there are fields missing within the register that haven't been completed or aren't up to date. And this is something that you need to work on to make sure that you keep it up to date. It's something that has to continually be reconciled to the data source and to be updated continually to make sure that the information in there is useful for you and useful for anybody who needs to look at it. Secondly, we're suggesting here that a monthly reconciliation of repairs reported and repairs completed is undertaken so that any outstanding repairs can be followed up and action taken to get them completed. So this would have arisen where we found that that's not the case, where the organisation perhaps has a lot of outstanding repairs or repairs taking a lot longer than expected. And this is a way of them being able to monitor that and to take action. Thirdly, and it links a little bit to the first point, it's about having a complete contract register in place so that details of all contracts are recorded centrally. And this is coming more from a contract management point of view, and ensuring that that contract register is useful for you in managing the pipeline for contract renewals and for knowing exactly what has been committed. And then finally, the other point we're highlighting here is around post-inspection reviews and making sure that they've been carried out on the agreed proportion of repairs and that this is included in performance reports. So this will help to monitor the quality of the repairs that are taking place and for boards to be assured that the appropriate number of post-inspections is taking place so that they're assured of the quality of those repairs. Some of the issues identified that I've just been talking about would have been exacerbated by the pandemic. You may have had to pause non-urgent work. There may have been issues with residents allowing you into their houses for routine work and inspections. There may have been contractor issues if they furloughed staff, leaving them unable to complete your programmes of work. And there's also a concern that tenants may not be reporting emergency repairs as they're reluctant to have people enter their home. In some instances, this is leading to an increased backlog of routine repairs. You may also have experienced supply issues with certain materials and parts. The regulator has reiterated in its 2020 sector risk profile that it's fundamental that boards are in possession of robust and up-to-date stock condition data, so it's vital that providers ensure that records are complete and accurate, that this is maintained by completing the necessary reconciliations, by providers monitoring the progress of work, and by monitoring the quality of work. The area of safety standards and legislation was the second biggest area for management actions, with 11 high priority and 85 medium priority actions agreed. The regulator highlights in the 2020 sector risk profile that it remains essential that providers take all reasonable steps to monitor and deliver statutory minimum requirements on health and safety, despite the practical challenges to doing so. So it's important that any control weaknesses in this area are addressed. This graphic shows the distribution of management actions in relation to safety standards and legislation. From our analysis, we found a slight shift in focus in actions agreed in this area. Interestingly, there were fewer actions agreed in relation to fire safety in 2019-20, perhaps because this had already been a major area of focus for providers in recent years. Actions relating to safeguarding, however, had increased significantly. Understandably, fire safety was a key focus for management actions following the Grenfell tragedy, and our latest Health of the Sector survey revealed that 91% of respondents had increased focus on health and safety legislation compliance in response to the tragedy. The majority of actions we agreed in 2019-20 related to safeguarding, gas safety, fire safety, and general health and safety, which included risk assessments, lone working, staff health and safety, including the processes in place where accidents or incidents occur. The majority of our 2019-20 audits were completed prior to the pandemic, and the key themes arising in this area are listed on the right-hand side of the slide. So, on broader health and safety, ensuring that the relevant risk assessments are undertaken on an annual basis, ensuring up-to-date policies and procedures are in place for tenant health and safety and safeguarding, and that's really important so that you know what you're measuring yourself against. Ensuring gas safety certificate expiry dates match those recorded on the system, so i.e. updating the system accurately, and that will then inform future inspections going forwards. Improving processes for recording safeguarding concerns and issues, and ensuring regular updates reported on progress with the inspection programmes. Two key impacts of the pandemic that we have seen when undertaking our audits in this area in 2020-21 are our clients having issues with gaining access to properties, for instance if residents are shielding or otherwise worried about letting people into their home, and issues where contractors furloughed staff, which meant planned inspection and servicing programmes have slipped. This has had a particular impact on those providers who may have already been struggling with backlogs of work. This makes it all the more important that data quality is maintained and the results of inspections are accurately recorded in what are often still manual databases. This in turn will ensure the reliability of reporting so that senior management and board have an accurate overview of the progress of programmes. It's also important to consider whether health and safety reporting is giving the full and complete picture. Even if it is accurate, it can still be presented in a way that gives the most positive picture rather than highlighting where there may be emerging issues that need to be dealt with. And finally, the importance of policies and procedures shouldn't be overlooked. This was one of the recurring areas where we agreed management actions, and it's really important that the organisation's policies are clear so that performance against them can be monitored and so that you can demonstrate this to the regulator. Our Health of the Sector survey in 2020 revealed that almost half of all digitalisation investments are not delivering the returns that respondents expected. This is a surprisingly high level of dissatisfaction for a sector that is investing significantly and placing significant reliance on transforming services and communication with tenants through embracing and spending heavily on new technologies. Getting a return on investment from new technology relies on setting realistic expectations, putting the right project governance in place, consulting fully with stakeholders, training staff, and learning lessons from previous projects. In this context, we saw an increase in IT-related management actions in 2019-20, with 9 high priority and 76 medium priority actions agreed. The majority of actions agreed related to IT security, but other areas included IT systems and infrastructure and IT governance. Management actions included ensuring that adequate remote access is in place using 2-factor authentication, particularly for systems containing sensitive personal data. Making sure there are restrictions on the ability to connect portable memory devices to network-connected workstations. Making sure staff have attended information security awareness and cyber security training. Having up-to-date information security email and internet policies. And those first 4 areas, I think you could see how important those controls would have become over the last 10 months, even more so than we were undertaking our audits in 2019-20. Going back to the list, reviewing firewall access regularly so that access remains appropriate, making sure all devices are up to date with the latest critical and security patches, and ensuring full system restoration testing from backup data is undertaken in accordance with an agreed schedule, and undertaking daily disaster recovery tests. All of those things I've mentioned there are critical controls, which our findings showed were not always being complied with as stringently as they should have been. So what do we need to think about in this area? The pandemic has brought with it an increased risk of fraud and cybercrime. This is nothing new, but increased levels of connectivity, remote working, reliance on technology and automation means the risk of attack is rising rapidly. The pandemic has made many organisations more vulnerable to cyber attacks because of relaxed control environments, revised processes and procedures, and changing employee workforce profiles. So it's really important that strong controls are in place in these areas. A significant number of the reviews I've referred to above were completed prior to the national lockdown in March 2020, and it is anticipated that IT-related actions will remain a top theme in 2020-21 due to the ever-changing environment and the increasing reliance placed on IT systems, particularly this year, where providers have had to adapt to the challenges presented by the lockdowns, including many housing professionals now working from home. So I've just summarised here the things to think about. Don't relax control environments, ensure revised processes and procedures are robust, and increase staff awareness of their responsibilities when working remotely. Although not one of the top 3 areas this year when looking at the total number of actions, overall this area had the highest number of high priority management actions, 16. This is perhaps not surprising, given that we do a lot of audits in financial areas and because it's a key area in which boards are looking for assurance, and also the fact that where there's a control weakness, it's often a high priority to address that weakness. There were some themes coming out where the high priority actions were agreed, and they could broadly be grouped into 3 areas. Value for money. Our results showed good use of global accounts, internal KPIs and benchmarking by external providers, but only 32% were working with their peers to benchmark VFM efficiency. We also agreed actions around ensuring that VFM frameworks are fully developed and are linked through from the strategic objectives to embed VFM within the organisation, and also that performance wasn't always being quantified as well as it could be. The processes around levers and also new starters and changes within the organisation was another area where we agreed actions around how changes are accurately captured on the system and the calculation of levers paid to ensure it's correct. This linked to an action around promptly identifying overpayments and making sure action to recover the overpayment is put in place promptly. And then around write-offs, another theme, making sure they're approved in line with the bad debt policy and scheme of delegation, and also that the 2 separate policies match each other so there's no ambiguity in the process as to where the authorisation should come from. Other action areas were largely in line with those found in previous years and related to financial processes. The first lockdown came just before the year end, with providers having to make initial forecasts on the impact of the pandemic on cash flows and business plans, and to continue to make adjustments to these as the scale of the pandemic became more apparent. With this and the increase in remote working, there have been some big changes seen in controls in financial areas. Some of the issues that we've seen during our work in 2020-21 include issues with sign-offs, and this includes everything from bank reconciliations to contracts. Without physically being present, other methods have had to be used. Whilst applications such as DocuSign provide a robust way of capturing sign-offs, for more operational areas, organisations have had to implement other methods and need to consider whether these are an adequate substitution for physical signatures. For instance, we have seen sign-offs which involve someone typing their name into a spreadsheet, which of course could be done by anyone. We have also seen instances where changes to processes have not been clearly communicated. So, for instance, one organisation took the decision to stop chasing current tenant rent arrears because of the financial difficulties facing many tenants, but this message was misunderstood by the team, who also stopped chasing former tenants. So actions to take include examining the controls that you've changed as a result of the pandemic and making sure they still offer the same assurance or more that the previous controls did, and making sure that business as usual activities, for instance control account reconciliations, are still undertaken as frequently as normal and within the same timescales, so that there's no decrease in the robustness of the control environment. So to finish off, I'll just give a quick roundup of some of the other key areas not already covered that were also themes in terms of management actions. Actions around policies, procedures and terms of reference are always recurring themes, but they're the basis of every control framework and therefore important that they're kept up to date so that they reflect current practice, so that they contain current responsibilities, and so that they're reviewed regularly so that update can be made where necessary. We also saw a number of actions to do with complaints. The Social Housing White Paper in England sets out a draft set of tenant satisfaction measures, which the regulator is expected to further develop in consultation with tenants and landlords, and this includes a measure for the effective handling of complaints, including the volumes of complaints and how quickly they're dealt with, as well as whether the tenant was content with how it was dealt with. So this is going to be an area of increased focus for organisations going forwards. Key performance indicators. That KPIs tell you what you need to know is a key question for boards to demand of management, and the English regulators' continued focus on data quality is keeping this at the forefront of areas that organisations are focusing on to improve. And finally, mandatory training, ensuring that staff have completed all the training that's necessary to keep them safe, keep customers safe, and comply with regulations and standards. So I hope that this has proved useful as a quick tour of the main issues coming out of our audits in 2019-20 and a bit of a look forward at how things will look when we do a similar analysis later this year. I hope that it's helped you to see whether or not your organisation is in line with what we're finding at others. Before I go, I'd just like to draw your attention to our 2021 Health of the Sector survey, which is now in its 14th year, and I think this year will have some particularly interesting results. I'd like to invite you to contribute to this and to submit your responses via our website as soon as you can, as the survey will be closing soon. Thank you.